First, thanks very much for organizing this at a beautiful location too. Yeah, I'm aware that when I talk about connectivity in ERP analysis, that I focus on an aspect that is not what most people currently discuss as connectivity. I'll also touch about more conventionally discussed types of connectivity, but the main thing is that we think that there are alternative aspects of connectivity which have to do with synchronization and which are currently underestimated in importance. So essentially we think that the field of connectivity, if you look at EEG and ERP analysis, particularly ERP analysis, you have an underlying stability of structure, but you have to really be aware if you want to describe the dynamics of connectivity that you have an evolution that is depending on a baseline connectivity, so you have to be aware of that part. You have also to consider structural and methodological constraints and also limitation, things that probably no single method can really resolve if you want to get at causal inferences about your data, about what causes what. Then we think there is really, or I think there are really two aspects to connectivity. One is synchronization, reflecting the fact that different regions are oscillating or activated in a correlated, highly correlated fashion. And there is that lagged correlation which allows inferences about causality, what is causing what if we do have all the relevant information. One of the important aspects is also that there are applications where the different types of lagged versus non-lagged connectivity matter, and where zero lag connectivity does contribute. And then there is also an aspect to consider what is synchronization or non-lagged connectivity telling us about neurophysiology. Is there a neurophysiological explanation for that, or is it just volume conduction? I also want to start out with noting that in the field of fMRI, where connectivity has been a bit later than with the EEG, but very important, becoming very important, that initial approaches to connectivity were really plain correlations, and lag was really not relevant. Lag was really not something that was was considered. That doesn't say that current approaches do ignore lags. Obviously, DCM analysis and other types of Granger causality models do imply lags and do take that into account. But much of the connectivity literature in fMRI was done without considering lags. Now, this is essentially the basic questions, the two types of connectivity: synchronization, which is essentially possibly due to one or possibly due to many oscillating or activated generators, or that just reflecting essentially different poles of volume conduction or volume conducted activity on the scalp. So the core concept there is either you have a very robust and precise source solution, or then you have to deal with the fact that this type of synchronization correlation that you're observing is reflecting physiological meaningful correlation plus physical volume conducted correlations. In this case, if you, yes, in the lower graph, if you have the lagged activity pattern or oscillation, then there is a clear case. If you have distinct sources generating them, then there is propagation or lagged connectivity. One of the interesting things when I was looking at the literature is that recent reviews, for example, there's reviews by Vistas and Schafflin, really does not deal at all with synchronization. It is really dealing with synchronization by saying this is essentially a problem, a common input problem. And if we have two essentially correlated activity patterns that are correlated but without a lag, without being in a temporal cascade. Now, I think the important thing is to consider that this is a very typical, I'm not sure how this pointer, it's outside. I think this is a very typical situation in ERP research, because you very often have situations where you, for example, observe activity in the two hemispheres with a common input, with a region controlling, modulating both activity patterns, and this is not observable or less well observable than cortical superficial activity. And this is just a reality of what we're observing. So as Thomas said in his entering lecture, we can either say we don't want to deal with that, we're going to find methods that completely ignore that, or we can say this is large part of what we're observing in event-related activity, and we're trying to model both lagged and synchronized activity patterns. And I vote for the latter approach. These are slides just showing that non-lagged instantaneous correlations do have a physiological reality. Obviously, they're very prominent, very strong if you look with intracranial recording in the animal literature. And they obviously also have a reality due to volume conduction, which, yes, which is essentially found across all frequency bands. If we look at just one aspect of event-related activity, the classical average evoked or event-related potentials, where we ignore the changes in synchronization, the changes in phase reorientation, and just look at what is phase locked to the stimulus, then what we find is typically an average evoked potential response, which tells us something about the course of information processing, and which typically shows up in, if we analyze it with a topographic and then with source models, shows up in stable source configurations with synchronously activated or oscillating or activating and changing generator patterns. And this is a very typical pattern that you can see. This is a visual N1 component with essentially at least two major bilateral generators, which are typically activated in synchrony. And many of the approaches and the source localization will tell you that the majority is that these two sources are activated in synchrony, turned off in synchrony, and then oscillate or are replaced by a different activation pattern. The way to classify this propagation pattern into microstates, and then from the microstates to look at essentially propagation of the information flow has been described before. This is another approach, a clustering approach, which was developed quite early. I think what is striking, and what always strikes me, is that really there is lots of activity that shows that concurrent parallel activation in sync in the brain due to stimulation, due to information processing is very prominent, and that also holds for anterior and posterior activation patterns. And so this is essentially a type of synchronization of left and right hemispheric activation, although there are subtle differences, right, in timing and in the propagation of this activation. This is shown here in this one slide where we had a source localization showing you essentially bilateral activation patterns. If we just look at the subtle part of the activation pattern, that is only found in one stimulus category, namely in words. And what you can see is the propagation within a very short time period in two successive microstates, both within the N1 component time range. And essentially we show here only the left hemisphere, which shows the differences between a word and a symbol condition. But the point is that you see very strong propagation very strong change, meaningful change in activation from visual input systems to in the direction towards the visual word form area. And so essentially there is some causal inference possible without looking at the connectivity already, just looking at the propagation, and then in a second stage looking at how these different activation patterns changing in time also reflect changing in connectivities. Oops. Yes, one important aspect that I think that is also a bit underestimated in discussions about how we can capture synchronization and lagged connectivity, complex activation patterns, is that maybe the methods themselves, source localization methods and methods getting at pure measures of information processing progression of lags and of directed connectivity patterns. Often these methods have lots of limitations or minor limitations, but in the real noisy experimental environment, they often have major limitations. And I think not everything can be resolved by computational methods alone. Some of the things have to be resolved, for example, by experimental approaches. So often if the question is whether something is explained just by volume conduction or just by a spread of activity, passive spread of activity, there are experimental approaches to tackle that. And this is from a very old study of ours where we looked at bilateral activation compared to unilateral activation. And essentially, if the bilateral activation would reflect no meaningful neurophysiological interaction and connectivity, but just passive summation of left hemisphere and right hemisphere activation adding up, then what you would find is that the sum would be identical to the bilateral response that you find. And this is not a case, and the interesting thing is this is not an amplitude difference, but it's a timing difference. So essentially there must be an interaction at a really quite early visual processing stage before 120 or 140 milliseconds, which essentially leads to bilateral interactions and suppressions, and the most probable mechanism, namely callosal, transcallosal interactions, is something that our ERP methodology is unlikely to directly reveal with high signal-to-noise ratio, in contrast to the different regional activations. So I think experimental approaches must complement the methodological signal processing approaches, trying to disentangle what is physiologically meaningful connectivity change and progression of information processing and what is essentially just the volume conducted activity that simulates some meaningful synchronization or connectivity. Okay, so there are some global measures that Thomas mentioned briefly at the beginning, essentially a measure of global strength or power, and there are measures of essentially in the frequency domain. This is not of interest, but this is of interest. Essentially, this is the complexity, which essentially parallels the development of the field of the reduction of field strength, probably due to synaptic pruning over the early years, particularly the early years until puberty of development. Okay, and if you look at, instead of complexity, if you look at synchronization, then you have the opposite pattern. Now the question is really whether these global measures tell you anything. They won't be able to tell you which region is connecting to which region, but do they tell you anything meaningful? I think they do tell you something meaningful. This is an example from a recent paper, I think in in a medical engineering computing journal, which looks at BCI prediction and which tells us that zero lag phase correlation is really helping the prediction in a BCI paradigm. And if we find methods that eliminates volume conduction and along with volume conduction also eliminates zero lag true connectivity, then you're losing prediction. So it can be physiologically quite meaningful. There are other types of studies looking at synchronization in source space. That's a paper from Jörg showing beta synchronization with perception, which is quite directional, essentially originating from the primary visual areas. And then there are these global field synchronization measures, which are not localized, but just can be indirectly localized in EEG fMRI experiments, as we did one. And what they tell you is that this kind of measure of synchronization of connectivity between different regions without lag is really a bit complementary to measuring the bold correlates of power fluctuations. That's in a working memory paradigm, in a developmental study, and essentially we found very prominent effects of development, comparing children with adults. And you can see that these patterns are quite distinct, the power correlates of bold correlates and field synchronization correlates. And if you look at regional aspects, that's not EEG source localization, but that's a bold correlate of these working memory load effects, then what you can see is that a global field synchronization really has a very meaningful correlate, namely it identifies the development of the working memory network, the frontoparietal working memory network, and that identifies that better, more precisely, and with more significance than just the spectral power, which is conventionally done in such analysis. Then obviously this is not only synchronization that measures connectivity. This is an example of an event-related potential study which looks at the more standard way of looking at connectivity. A very nice finding, I think, where this group analyzed event-related potentials in a phonological and a semantic condition, and could show that essentially there are many parallel things in the activation patterns, but essentially there are also time windows where you have reliable differences, and these can be modeled by essentially Granger type causality pattern as a increased forward connectivity in the left temporal region if you work in the semantic condition. So this is coming very close to understanding causal aspects of information processing, directions, and yes, this work has done is quite nice and also properly considered the baseline connectivity patterns. And this is another example of a group from Christoph's group, essentially looking at essentially also directed ERP connectivity based on single trial analysis and source space, and here you find essentially the essential figure, so showing that you do get changes in connectivity patterns suggesting early recurrence, so that you not only have progression of information, but you also have very early feedback from higher order regions. So if I summarize my point of view regarding connectivity analysis of event-related activity, obviously it builds heavily on what has been said before. It builds on the same methods and on the same constraints as analysis of spontaneous activity, and relates to what has been said about event-related aspects by Laura and by Thomas and by Scott before. But I really want to make the point that the zero lag correlation or the synchronization of multiple regions is an important aspect of event-related activity and should not just be discarded because of methodological problems of interpreting this synchronization in terms of pure neurophysiology and problems with volume conduction. We think that there are other approaches too if you really want to get at exclude essentially contributions of pure volume conduction. For example, experimental approaches where you have different experimental conditions and where you test essentially the additivity aspect implicit in the no interaction case, where essentially two sources or two activations are just summating without any interactions. This bilateral example is, bilateral stimulation example was for that. Then I think what is special if you look at event-related connectivity is that you really have to be aware that you're looking at event-related changes, at induced changes, and in order to properly interpret them, you really need to deal with the baseline connectivity patterns, and you also need to be aware that your methods, for example, your filters, can be quite devastating and can introduce changes in connectivity in time windows backwards. So if you don't use simple forward filters. So my conclusion is essentially that it's a very, very promising and very interesting field. We have many advancing tools available, very interesting methods, but we also have a tendency to just focus on good methods and forget about the experimental approaches. And I think the good methods, signal processing methods, and solid experimental approaches to disentangle critical aspects of connectivity should be combined. So thank you for your attention.